is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Tape number 394, June 22nd, 1979. And this is side one. I promised you an update on the book Alternative 3 that we haven't talked about for a long time. And I'm glad to be able to keep that promise. We'll do that this week on this tape. Sometimes I make intentions far in advance, but other news takes primary consideration. But we will go into Alternative 3, hopefully, for both sides of this tape. Before I do that, there's just one article that I do want to mention that was in the Associated Press, United Press this week. It has to do with a CIA agent, an officer by the name of Regis T. Blahut, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, who was guarding information for the House Select Committee on Assassinations in Washington, D.C., and he made the mistake at looking at some of the pictures and documents that he was guarding, and that he was fired, this article said, by the CIA for what they called curiosity. Now, the thing that interests me is that they said he exercised curiosity and judgment in thumbing through an album of exhibits belonging to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I take issue with the word belonging to the House Committee on Assassinations. What he saw belongs to the whole nation. We pay the taxes for investigating this. We pay for the great loss of losing the president. We not only lost John Kennedy, but right after that was Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Robert Kennedy, and the Chappaquiddick affair with Mary Jo Kopechne dead, and the Wallace shooting and the Rockefeller murder, a succession of political murders. And if you study the history of John Kennedy and those 1,000 days he was in office, just before he died, Patrice Lumumba died at the hands of the CIA DM, and his brother died over in Vietnam, and Dag Hammarskjöld from the United Nations died, all linked to the Central Intelligence Agency. Now they're saying that this information belongs to them and it was loaned to the House Select Committee. How long are we going to stand for this monkey shines business? It was a book that this agent was looking at, photographs of the head wounds that killed John Kennedy. Of course, that House Select Committee was such a fraud, and I objected immediately. One of the first witnesses was a woman who drew 10,000 little pieces of hair for $10,000, and once again, the negatives were not shown to the world, the ones, the fatal headshots of John Kennedy or his back shots. This gentleman was dismissed. They said the case was closed. He hadn't broken any law, but they found his fingerprints on these files that he was guarding. Now, he was hired by the Central Intelligence Agency, it says, to guard documents loaned to the investigation. Again, they belong to the CIA. They're loaned to the House Committee investigating the assassinations. No, they belong to us. What business do they have to lock up any evidence when the President of the United States was killed? They describe a room that was designated as a security area where material was locked up, in which they said was a safe for their own material, their material, but he made the mistake of looking at a book of photographs that wasn't authorized, and they found his fingerprints, and they find out that he's the one who opened the book, and they fired this guard. They said he hadn't done anything really wrong, except he looked at something that is owned, loaned, belonging to the Central, pardon me, to the Central Intelligence Agency. Hardly. I think it belongs to us and shouldn't even be in their hands, with their record of assassinations and links to assassinations around the world, whether it's Mr. Letelier in Washington or Allende in Chile, heads of states all over the world. Why is this their material? Explain that to me so that we both understand. What this particular agent said, Mr. Blahut said about the statements regarding him, it was quoted in the Washington Post, was, quote, there's other things that are involved that are detrimental to other things, and which under his CIA secrecy oath he couldn't discuss. Now, the CIA said they didn't know what that means. There was no plot or anything, that the House Committee was going to close their investigation and come out with a report soon that there was a second gunman, probably, who fired at least one shot at Kennedy in Dallas. But of course, he missed it. The fatal headshot had to come from Lee Harvey Oswald. It disturbs me that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court said that there were things that we couldn't see until each of us that were deceased by the year 2039. I guess that's why there's so much interest in reincarnation these days. We can come back and view it a second time around, maybe as somebody's puppy dog or who knows what. But the point is that the CIA considers it their material. Who killed the President of the United States is their material, and if their agent peeks at it and he's not supposed to, or leaks on it and he's not supposed to, he's fired. And it comes out loud and clear now that that information belongs to them, was loaned to the House, and that even their own guards weren't supposed to see it. Of course, we know from the minutes of the Warren Commission meetings in 1964, when they first began, that all the secretaries and women helping type and file were CIA women who were on leave because they were pregnant or whatever reasons. The entire staff that ran the investigation of the President of the United States murder, the murder of Officer Tippit, and then Lee Harvey Oswald, or an Oswald double, whichever you want, not to confuse it at this point. The point is that the CIA has the control of the material, and they are the ones that have been fingered from the very first day as being the culprits in the assassination team. They came out later through force of investigators to admit they had assassination teams linked to organized crime, and now it seems that this particular gentleman, Regis T. Blahut, was fired out of a little curiosity at what they are keeping from us. And I think it's outrageous, and I think we should write to members of Congress and call attention to the media on radio talk shows and so forth about the fact that the CIA thinks it's their property when it really belongs to all of us. We have to take all the insults on the news media being the conspiracy buffs, the conspiracy theorists, half-baked and looking for a profit, all the usual insults, while they hold on to the material, they do the investigation, and they fire their agents who take a little peek. Now to Alternative 3. I got a letter last week from probably one of our finest, current, best historians in this country, certainly one of the best that I know of, Charles Spears, who lives in Sherman, Texas. Many of you who correspond with him know of his work, and he signs his letters student of history and economics, and God knows he's done a lot of work. And Charles, this tape is dedicated to you and others like you who are still skeptical of the book Alternative 3, or the shenanigans in space. Charles wrote me a letter last week, and he said he was very concerned about my continuing talking about Alternative 3. And he said Alternative 3 and that bull about present space station genocide is to me as crazy as Rush Harp talking about a replacement for President Carter. Rush is another researcher who lives back east in New York, who's been saying that Jimmy Carter has been cloned and that there's a duplicate taking his place. And, of course, Charles and I agree that that is totally ridiculous. And he says, please don't get pissed off with me. I'm dedicated to Mae Brussell, so that's why I don't want her to go off on such wild tangents. Please stay on Earth. Nothing could be worse than what's going on here. You've got him on Jonestown and the Nazi Galen Dulles connections. Please stay on that sort of double-line track to the truth. Odessa's Galen died Friday. Of course, I mentioned that last week on the tape, and there was an article in the Washington Post and New York Times about Reinhard Galen's death, and the Washington Post had an article about Frank Naj. The New York Times hasn't done it. At least I haven't seen it yet. So I'm answering back because Jonestown and Alternative 3 and Galen are not far apart from each other. They're not separate. They're part of the same body, and I just think it's a matter of time until Charles will begin to understand what I'm trying to do when I talk about Alternative 3, and I hope I can make it as clear as possible to all of you who don't have the past tapes. You'll have to get those to catch up on it. But I don't consider the study of spaceships a wild tangent. I don't believe that it is possible to, in quotes, stay on Earth when the government has billions and millions of dollars into space programs that are made by Earthlings. It doesn't matter where they land. They are made by Earth people. And they are made by Earth people like Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun and 742 Nazis that had flying saucers, that had secret weapons in Germany, that brought us their atomic weapons and their hydrogen bombs and their atomic bombs and all their little secret goodies. And I have given the name of several books you can order. There's a whole list of them, but I'll give you again. One is The UFO, The Nazi Secret Weapon, and the other is Secret Nazi Polar Expeditions. There is a lot of literature that Earthlings are playing around with up there. Therefore, what goes on up there can't be ignored. It didn't start. I'm not talking about people up there, little people with pointy ears and humanoid characteristics that land down on Earth. I'm not talking about sightings of things that are unexplained emanating from up there but coming down here. What I'm trying to find are the sources of what's emanating here that are linked to Allen Dulles, to Reinhard Gehlen, to Jonestown. And so it's impossible to stay on Earth when the United States government is putting information about designing their space stations. You see the difference between Rush Harp talking about Jimmy Carter being cloned and Mae Brussell talking about the United States building space stations is that Jimmy Carter's cloning comes from only one source, Peter Beater, who is way off base on his material on Jonestown. He never gives references to support his evidence. He has no physical evidence of the childhood of Jimmy Carter or where the clone was transferred or who did the medical work or where he's coming from. He's a far right-wing, violently anti-communist, part of the Cold War scare. Peter Beater has become totally unreliable as a source of any kind of information. The difference is that when you talk about spaceships, you're talking about billions of funding. You're talking about meetings at Princeton University of the top leaders of the United States just a month or so ago. As I say, the government printing office will sell $5 now. I'll give you the address, the blueprints and plans for space colonies. We're talking about the Pentagon's chemical divisions for enzymes for race genocide, the CIA's use of mass mind control, the intent of Gehlen to make people slaves and subhuman. As far back as 1939, he was arranging that. And then Alternative 3, of course, goes into the 15-year batch consignment work, slave labor, and then the people are killed. Well, von Braun and Dornberger were doing that at their rocket factories in Germany, and Farben was using people just till they died. They didn't supply them food, but they worked till they died in their synthetic rubber and oil plants. Auschwitz was put right at the edge of the Farben factories so that they could dispose of the people. When they put in a day's labor and couldn't work anymore, they were killed off and more were brought in. We're talking about money that was financed by the financiers, Ford Motor Company and General Motors and Hughes and these Corning Steel, U.S. Steel, Corning Glass, the huge corporations, the people that rule and run America, and the Kaiser Aluminum. We're talking about the huge base corporations that put money into Adolf Hitler, that put money into Farben, that approved of genocide slave labor, that brought the Nazis out to the Bahamas, the United States, the aerospace industry. When you have the technology to do these space colonies, which they have now, when you have the intent for genocide, which they've showed clearly, when you have their past performance of slave labor at the rocket factories at Peenemünde or Auschwitz or all over Poland and Germany, when you have the funding, which is unlimited, when you have the government sponsorship, not only in Germany but in the United States and England and all over the world, when you have the immigration of the Project Paperclip scientists that were into microwave burnings and genocides, when you have government collusion in killing leaders and silencing information in media, why can't space colonies for genocide be possible? You know, the one thing that the right has in common, the staunch conservative, and I keep repeating this, is they have money, they have education, they have technology, they have power, they have Congress in their pocket, they have the courts in their pocket, they have the medical institutions in their pocket, they have the sources of energy in their pocket, whether it's the minerals in the ocean, the coal, the water, the oil, the steel, uranium, chromium, plutonium, the diamonds, the plastics, you name it. They have it, they want to keep it, they'll fight to keep it. The one thing that the do-gooders do, the left, the oppressed, the poor, don't have in common is a unity of goal or intent to study the other side. They split with themselves, they're divided, they're confused, they get infiltrated, and they shouldn't splinter over things that are very, very important. Now, if I am wrong about these, and I'm going at length because of the difference, say that Charles Spears has with Mae Brussell, and because I respect him so much, if I am wrong, he should prove me wrong. Otherwise, he should get onto the space thing too. I know it's hard when you're fighting the federal government to talk about space or space programs, but let's get on with some of the evidence and the information. And I'm going to give you a list like I did with my work on Jonestown files that I broke down. After I read Alternative 3, I began to take articles I had on space colonies and break them into separate envelopes or categories to put all new information that comes so that I can study it as seriously as I studied Reinhard Gehlen and Alan Dulles. And remember, I was on to those guys, those dogs, as early as 1965, which was a few years ago, 14 years ago, long before people even breathed the Gehlen agents were in the Dallas-Fort Worth area working with Lee and Marina Oswald. So if I'm 10 or 12 years ahead of a lot of serious researchers on this, and some people are into the space thing very much. There's a woman in Minneapolis, Marge Gibson, who sends me piles of articles on space and UFOs that has turned me on to a lot of material. You can't separate this phenomena from the past. It's part of the same fabric. So I've broken my files on space or space programs into comparisons of UFO conferences. There'll be one July 7th and 8th up here in Burlingame for those of you on the West Coast that want to attend. The one I attended in San Francisco was identical to the conspiracy conferences on the JFK assassinations right on down the line, and maybe I'll give you some of the comparisons. I'm saving all the articles on space colonies, all the articles denying that the colonies exist, coming from one of the astronauts right now. Nobody else has come up forward and said they don't exist yet. All information on the space shuttle program, any articles I have on space stations, any articles on the brain drain, on the space colonies like Gerard O'Neill, the government printing office, information on their design and manufacture, articles that there's too many people on Earth. That's one of the motives. The other is that there's air pollution. Another one on the actual building contracts and structures of the stations. Another one on microwave and space weapons. I have another file on the USSR cooperation with the United States on this matter. Another on missing persons and airplanes. Another file on Ford Communications and their role in building space structures, Ford Motor Company. China and the space stations. The moon trips, were they fake, or were there UFOs and buildings on there? One thing we know, they were not telling the truth about what happened just 10 years ago when the United States was supposed to have launched the first landing on the moon. It happened, it seems, much longer than that, and they were lying about what took place there. I'm saving articles on the religious role and the Jesus freak connections to the astronauts, the budgets for NASA spending, job changes of astronauts from moon shops to corporations and Congress and so forth, UFO sightings, the politics of Cold War, the Skylab that's falling, space and the use of mind control and psychological problems. I'm saving articles on satellites and communications, space and spy satellites, which I've had for a long time, and the use of space for transponders, identification of people, and I have a file on books and bibliography on space. There was a gentleman who was here in San Francisco a couple of months ago with a new book. His name is Jacques Vallée. He just came out with a book called Messengers of Deception. He wrote another book on UFOs about 10 or 12 years ago. And Jacques Vallée was on the West Coast. I went to hear him in San Francisco. And this is what he says about his reinterpretation of the UFOs. And this goes, again, into Alternative 3 in the space colonies. He said the idea of contact with higher intelligence is going to be one of the social time bombs, that the use of the UFOs and the producing of people who have been hypnotized by various psychiatrists is to scare people, to get them into religious cults and to make them feel that they're in touch with higher intelligence. He said they're creating this aura of special communication with outer space. Vallée studied UFOs, as I say, for many years, and now he's changed his mind totally about the use of the intelligence agencies, implying combined agencies such as Navy intelligence, CIA, Air Force intelligence. He said he has changed his mind about UFOs. The mysterious objects that are sending tremors all over are very real. He says they're not spaceships at all. They are instruments constructed right here on Earth. They're being used for deceptions. They have a special purpose, he says, which is mass deception and manipulation of our minds. As I say, Valley won't be present at that conference, but if you want to go, it's up in Burlingame near the airport in San Francisco, July 7th and 8th. There are going to be 7 or 8 people, Earthlings, who have been on spaceships and been visited by space people. And it'll be interesting to see or hear these people. I think it's the first convention where they're going to be present. Each one of them is immediately taken to a hypnotist after they allegedly have these phenomena that take place. And Valley claims that they're being manipulated and that they're purposeful manipulation of our minds. He says they're probably under the control of the intelligence agencies of one or more countries. Of course, we know the Nazis, if you call Germany and the Nazis a country, and indeed they are, have worked on UFO projects down in Argentina, Antarctica, and the Bahamas for a long, long time with the United States. He says there are flying saucers and there are unexplained pulsating lights that are seen by millions of people, Valley says, but he believes that now that they are carefully staged, they are technologically sophisticated, they are charades designed to draw attention and spread belief in powerful visitors from outer space. He helped with the movie The Close Encounters of the Third Kind, this Jacques Vallée, and it's interesting to know that Mr. Stanfield, his name is Stanfield, who is the head of 20th Century Fox, that made a mint of money over that movie, The Close Encounters of the Third Kind, was a graduate from Annapolis, probably the class of Jimmy Carter. I might have mentioned that once before on the tapes. They took the money from the movie. It was so successful and bought a huge hunk of the Monterey Peninsula known as Pebble Beach. Back to Jacques Vallée, he said, look away now from the UFOs. Don't try to figure out who or what they are so much as the cults that are being built around them. There's a group of people who are going to link them, he says, to Christ and religion, and he also has pointed out that there were plans for the CIA to have the second coming of Christ, get rid of Fidel Castro, and combine it with a religious experience. And I think you should watch the astronauts as they get more into Christ and religion also, as they go lecturing around about their religious experiences. He says that there's going to be a whole new religion of people who see space people. They're building religions and making symbols such as the flying saucer cult that they're growing all over the country. Valley said that the cattle mutilation mystery, and I talked briefly about that last week on the other tape on 393, may have been linked and has been identified now as being part of a sophisticated manipulative process at work. I mentioned on that other tape that they were taking slices of the animal for medical testing for enzymes for genocide, and I also mentioned that these testings were done at Dugway, Utah, the chemical warfare division that was run by Dr. Lawrence Layton, whose family sponsored and funded a good hunk of Jonestown when it first got started. His son is down in the jail now, Larry Layton. His daughter, Debbie Layton, blew some of the story. Her son-in-law set up the funding and got away when the others were killed, and his wife gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to Jim Jones with money from Germany coming down there. And Valley says that the cattle mutilations are linked to this whole phenomenon, and that these very sophisticated surgical slices are manipulated and associated with UFOs, which are seen at the time of the manipulations. He says it's entirely possible that widespread systematic mass deceptions are taking place since World War II. He's dated that time period as World War II, since this purposeful thing has been taking place. He said British intelligence did it. They had a division called the Martians. They had phantom armadas. They had phantom battalions. They had phony troop movements, and it was not only a tool against the Germans, but they used it to cool and conspire and to deceive their own British citizens as well. So Valley says this isn't a new phenomenon for deception. Jacques Vallée is saying that we should study the UFOs and not just the evidence. Now this is a good quotation. Not just the evidence that we are carefully fed, but what is behind the evidence and what that evidence is supposed to make us think. Now when you take the book Alternative 3, and as I said, past tapes, tape number 380, 381, and 384 have mentioned a good part of it on Alternative 3, so I'm not going to repeat that. You'll have to get the back tapes because many of you have them. But what Vallée is saying is take what we are fed, the evidence that we are very carefully fed, and what is behind the evidence, and what the evidence is supposed to make us think and study it. Now that applies to the book Alternative 3, because the only difference between that book and what's really happening that they admitted happened is that some of this space station is already taking place and that these missing people are already up there and they're well into developing these colonies that allegedly are to begin in a few years with 10,000 people and then 20 million people. We are led to think, if you look at the drawings of Gerard O'Neill and the cornucopia that the government printing office has out now, you'll have to buy it for $5, and look at the glory of these little colonies, and particularly the book of Gerard O'Neill and the drawings that he had in an earlier magazine at Penthouse. It's a total nirvana. It's heaven on earth. You have your colony for vegetarians and blacks and whites and Jews and smokers and non-smokers. All your desires are answered. There's no more pollution or radiation. There's streams flowing. There's trees. There's vegetation. All fun and games. It's a beautiful Garden of Eden picture. The pictures that they've already published of what it's going to look like. Now that's what they're supposed to make us think it is. Valley says the UFO evidence should not be accepted at face value, but should be examined for signs of conscious deception. And that's why he calls his book The Messengers of Deception. He says there are social and political issues involved here. That's Messengers of Deception by Jacques Vallée. Research, Box 1107, Aptos, California, 95993, now has some copies of Alternative 3. Now, what was in the news last week that would apply to this kind of thinking that we're talking about? June the 9th, there's an article, Associated Press, study finds dirtier U.S. air. The nation's air is getting dirtier with pollution, creating haze affecting visibility across the country. The airports in East, Midwest, Southwest are declining in visibility. The Southwest used to have pristine air. It is now to 20 to 30% declining in its last 2 decades in terms of pollution. In the Midwest and East, the visibility has declined from 10 to 40%. The declines in visibility are blamed primarily on increases in the amount of sulfur oxide, nitrogen oxide, and ozone in the air. The sulfur and nitrogen oxides react with other airborne elements to form haze. That's one article, June the 9th. June the 3rd, Washington Post, Global 2000. Uncle Sam peers into the 20th century. You look at a picture of Gerald Barney, he really does look like the Frankenstein or mad scientist. This is an article that said at Jackson Place Townhouse in Washington, D.C., there's a man named Gerald O. Barney who works on the Council of Environmental Quality. He's in charge of Global 2000. It's a study of world population, natural resources, and environment. He was formerly a physicist with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. He worked for the Rockefellers, and now he's in charge of environmental problems. He says the U.S. government has people studying energy, agriculture, economics, but they don't talk with each other. The population bomb is such, he says, that even if India alone were to reproduce rate of 1 in, he says, reach a net reproductive rate of 1 in the year 2000, its peak population would be 1.5 billion people. That's more than the present population of Africa, South America, North America, Oceania, and Europe combined. A population means doubling food, energy, clean water, minerals, schools, housing in a world where hunger, fuel shortages, disease, illiteracy, and homelessness are the norm. He said the world will make it into the year 2000. It will look like it does today, 20 years from now. But that will be its superficial appearance. It is deceiving. The cushion won't be there anymore. The stress will be more severe in every sector: energy, water, forests, food. Are the scientists talking to the industrialists? He said when each nation does not ask how much coal they're going to burn, you find that the carbon dioxide will be there and the total amount exceeds the ability of the atmosphere to absorb it. And that's what Alternative 3 is about, that the Earth won't be able to absorb the waste and that they have to build these colonies, and they're building them through slave labor like Galen did, like Galen designed and had the work drones and originated the idea, not originated, but in our era since World War II and starting at the end of World War I. Mr. Barney says, we hope the study will lead to the reconsideration of some policies and lead to quite a different future. What policies and what future, he wouldn't elaborate. But he says the Earth will definitely exceed the ability of the atmosphere to absorb what it is doing, and that is going to lead to a future. He doesn't say what, but he hints, wait and find out. May 23rd, San Jose Mercury, a devastating look at the year 2000. Charles Warren, chairman of Jimmy Carter's Environmental Quality, working on energy, he said the year 2000, 20 years from now, will be devastating, terrifying. There's no major policy change by the multinationals. The Earth will be depleted of tropical forests. Nowhere on Earth except in the oceans will animals breed in the wild. The ability to feed will be inadequate. The soil and sea capacity will be dwindled. There will be trapped carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a blanket over the Earth, arid over Africa and South America, and the wetlands are being destroyed. This is projected for 2 years from now. We'll do more on the other side of this tape on Alternative 3. This is Mae Brussell. This is side 2 of tape number 394, June 22nd, 1979. For your pleasure, you can order from the government printing office, it was just advertised this last month, a book. This is document 20T9, Space Settlements, a Design Study. This book's described our astronauts have accomplished the amazing feat of walking on the moon. What next? Can people live in space in permanent colonies? Get this fascinating publication, Space Settlements, this illustrated book. It's the result of a 10-week program at Stanford University and NASA's Ames research by a group of scientists on the colonization of space. It will provide hours of reading enjoyment, a detailed and sound technology, the construction and permanent habitation of 10,000-person space wheel between Earth and the Moon is presented, every detail needed for the settlement, including the recycling of all materials, self-supporting food chain, and so forth. You can get your illustrations, your fascinating text, and your projections of space exploration. That's government printing office, $5. I suggest those of you that are skeptical read that, but always keep in mind the sense of history of how these same people have not provided summer jobs for our youth who are closing down the libraries. There's no money for medical research. Cancer is on the upswing. The ghettos and the cities are atrocious. The vandalism in the schools is terrible. There is no planned program for the old in this country, the mentally sick, and these same people that have cut off all the funds for society on planet Earth to make it better are pushing this great space settlement. What makes you think it'd be any better there than what they're doing here with polluting the waters and the streams and lying about their machinery? And going along with it, a 19T9, a supplemental book for $2.50 on the space shuttle, and it tells about the advances in medicine and environment and so forth that the shuttle makes, and that with the advent of the shuttle in 1980, there'll be a whole new era of transportation that'll come into being, and that it will orbit and perform a lot of experiments and construction and maintenance functions, and it can be launched in 2 weeks. It says it will be relaunched in 2 weeks. The space shuttle will be designed to reduce the cost and increase the effectiveness of space for commercial science and defense needs. You can order these 2 books. This is not science fiction. This is from the government printing office, and they're pushing that along. In addition to that, I just briefly mentioned, I think on another tape a couple of weeks ago, an article that one of the listeners sent to me from New Jersey. It's out of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Space awaiting colonists. Space is just waiting for their colonists. It says this large article, 200 industrialists, diplomats, social scientists, physicists met, this was in May last week, to discuss construction of space satellites within the next 15 years. As I say, the only difference between what these articles are projecting, the only difference is that the book Alternative 3 says that this is well into taking place right now. Just like Jacques Vallée comes along and tells you, wait a minute, there are saucers, you better examine them. There are a lot of people who have said that right along, and they were called crazy. And now it turns out that people who were talking about flying saucers have to backtrack and reevaluate who was doing the manipulating and why they were doing it. These space colonies may be existing right now, which is the allegation of that particular book, Alternative 3, And what they're selling us in the newspapers all the time is the necessity for it, and all of a sudden it will be there. This conference was headed by Gerard O'Neill, who's described in the book Alternative 3. The conference was at Princeton University, which is no slouch place for such serious people to be talking. In May of 79, it was under the auspices of the American Institute of Aeronautics and NASA and branches of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Agency. The satellites must be built. This is the idea at the meeting, the convention. They must be staffed with space colonizers, and they talked about taking the material and rocks from the moon to do the construction, and about orbiting satellites and colonies that would have to be built, and built through private industry. A lot of people in private industry at the meeting were reluctant to invest. I guess they don't want a Holiday Inn space station or a Hilton space station or McDonald's hamburger space station yet, because they said it would cost between 35 million and 100 billion, or 35 billion and 100 billion. So they're not ready to put their hotels up there in space. That was the consensus of the article. It'd be a little expensive for them right now to get that going. But just wait and see. They'll get into it once it gets a little cheaper, I'm sure. The social scientists talked about the intergroup characteristics of the space colonies and the kind of social systems that would be set up. And a Dr. Stephen Cheston from Georgetown University talked about the practical problems of beds and tactile feeling and so forth. And then they talked about the psychological frustrations of children and the problems it would create with their families in space stations, and the psychological makeup of people. There were anthropologists at this conference, and in other words, there were all kinds of facets of people at Princeton University talking about the future psychological problems under the direction of Dr. Stephen Cheston of Georgetown University, not far separated from the CIA think tanks there, and offering ideas on the makeup, the anthropological effects of space. There were lawyers that suggested government structures for space colonies. There were anthropologists at the meeting talking about the psychic effects of living away from Earth. This was no slouch meeting. There were 200, as I say, industrialists, diplomats, physicists, and social scientists at Princeton University, and I think that meeting is as important as the Bilderberger meetings that people yell about, or the trilateral meetings, just what these people are cooking up in the way of their little space colonies. There's a newsletter that comes out of Belfast, Ireland, Earthlink magazine, and they had an article, More Facts on Alternative 3, and they covered the links of the Soviet Union with the United States and are writing about this. Remember, this book came out in England, and there's a newsletter about it, and they refer to past articles that they've had that have led up to Alternative 3. And they say that the United States and the Soviet Union are working together, that there's radioactivity on the planet, that it is increasing steadily, and that will kill everybody within 3 generations. And that the Soviet Union is forced to cooperate with the United States. They're compelled to set up joint space ventures to these elite colonies. Now, this newsletter says the first colony was set up in 1962. We made a mistake by splitting the atom instead of fusing it. We have no way to store the waste, that there is 714 million years of virulent uranium around and no actions for storing it, and there is no hope of fusing it before the end of the century, which will be too late. The newsletter from Ireland says the madness wasn't deliberate when it started, but the radiation started making with the bombs and the Nazis, and then Israel and India, the Russians got into the atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, China, English, the French, the Americans, and Germans, and they exploded this radioactivity into the air where it's still circling. And now they have to look for a way out, and the only way out was outer space, and therefore they have to censor the truth, and they have to combine in secret. This is a newsletter that came out September 9th, 1977, from Belfast, Ireland. This newsletter asks the question, how is it possible to keep this information from 4 million people? And it goes on to talk about the keeping the UFOs secret all this time, and even the President of the United States said he saw UFOs and promised no secrecies in that part of our national adventure, but he's hushed up. They refer to a book, G.H. Leonard, which I have, Someone Else is on Our Moon, And this newsletter talks about the attempt to hide all the UFO information, and they persist in hiding the effect of the radioactivity danger. It's too late. They're already committed to a Moon-Mars adventure. The only way to get there now is with nuclear energy, and this is why they say that there's 200 fast breeder reactors in Europe, that in order to make the space stations, you need the nuclear energy to launch them, even though the nuclear energy will foul up the Earth, because their thinking is that it's going to be fouled up anyway. The propaganda for the space colonies is that greenhouse effect, which you read about in the newspapers more and more every day. The carbon monoxide from your cars and factories is overwhelming the planet. But what this newsletter says that the real danger and the idea behind the space colonies is the radioactivity, not the carbon monoxide and the greenhouse effect, but the actual poison and pollution of the water and the earth and everything around us from the radioactivity that we've already started. That newsletter, Earthlink, evidently has been going on quite a few years. They have references to a 1972 article that they published and one in 75 that led up to this alternative 3. And of course, these are the allegations that these colonies began a long time ago, and they go into the killer satellite weapons and the beam transmitters and the way the satellites will be used for warfare, in addition to housing people to get them off planet Earth. There's an article in the Los Angeles Times, Sunday, May 27th, 1979. British brain drain hits record. Net loss is 22,700. That was the allegation of Alternative 3, that many people, scientists, astronomers, aerospace people, were leaving, and no trace of them was found at the point where they were supposed to arrive at the particular locations in California, Australia, and so forth. This article says in 1977, 22,700 people left, that England is crying because there's, in quotes, a hemorrhage of talent, that 65,000 people in the management category left in 1977, in the management category. 58,000 went to Australia and New Zealand, 29,000 were supposed to go into Europe, and 20,000 to the United States. 52,000 left between 1974 and 1977. There have been clerical manual laborers also that have left. In 1974, there were 51,000. That was in 1974. In 1977, 24,500. Now, it was because of the brain drain of scientists, astronomers, and people leaving Great Britain to go to the United States and Australia and other countries that a TV show was given in London on the missing, it was called The Brain Drain, not The Missing People. And then when they wanted to find these people, it turned out that they were missing. I won't repeat, as I say, what was on the other tapes. I just want to update you that there is this article in the Los Angeles Times, British brain drain hits record. It doesn't say where they are or if they are around or if they arrived where they say they're arriving. It's just that they do take note of what is very much a part of the book Alternative 3 on the British brain drain. The Washington Star had an article this last May the 8th, 1979, CIA military ride high on space shuttle, and it tells how they're getting more and more active in the space shuttle program. NASA and the Air Force and the Houston Space Center, and Senator Lowell Weicker, Jr. from Connecticut, was an early supporter for the space shuttle, and he wrote in a letter to NASA, "I'm deeply disturbed to learn of your briefing by CIA Director Stansfield Turner of a close interface between NASA and the CIA on the shuttle program." He said this was contrary to the traditional separation between civilian and military space program, and he's fearful that it may jeopardize involvement of the scientific community in what should have been a peaceful exploration and the development of space. He's concerned about the CIA's involvement. And in the same article, in the Washington Star, May the 8th, it's an article, CIA's military ride high on space shuttle. It tells how the Space Center in Houston, Texas, that always had maximum security, goodness knows it was hard to get in there, has increased the physical surroundings of their buildings. The CIA is so deeply involved in the space shuttle that the CIA asked for and is spending $600 million, $600 million, not for more colonies or space work, but to increase and protect the security and secrecy of the space shuttle and what they're going to do. NASA and Houston, Texas have tight security now around their installations, but they want to increase and curtail any public access to certain sections, and they want to get hardware and electronic communications to avoid any outside interference or eavesdropping. Now, this reminds me of Adolf Hitler's rocket factories that put him on the suggestion that in Alternative 3 of the batch consignments or genocide. Why does the Central Intelligence Agency, and I'm asking that question, of course the answer is right implied there in the question, need $600 million more to protect the defense around the shuttle program? Why do they have the monitors there, the electronic equipment, the guards. It's like the House Select Committee on Assassination having the man guarding the files take a peek at the files. The CIA needs $600 million to increase just upstairs in the building. They already have installations. NASA has installations. The shuttle program has. And what they're trying to do, according to the article, is cut off public access to certain sections of the area that involve space shuttle programs and involve the Central Intelligence Agency. And whenever you get such secrecy, when you get Mr. Parry, William J. Parry, the Defense Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, talking about this, when you get the Defense Department in with the Central Intelligence Agency at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston, putting $600 into tighter security into one building that's already secure, that involves the use of the CIA and space, it requires the kind of outrage that Senator Weicker had that I didn't see in any paper except the Washington Star, where he said that he's disturbed that the CIA and NASA are working together on the shuttle program that was supposed to be a civilian, peaceful exploration, and they're increasing their budget for secrecy for just one building of $600 million. Remember in Alternative 3, the TV movie that was on the brain drain in London brought the response of a man who had been to NASA and brought out documents of the plans for genocide and told about the meetings in submarines or in the Antarctica under the icy waters where these plans for genocide are made. With $600 million security equipment, you'd never have another squealer telling you what's going on in those space colonies. Zodiac News, October 18th, 1977, that was almost 2 years ago, said that America's civilian space agency, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, NASA, is in danger of being militarized by the Pentagon. Pacific News said that the military space projects are now taking up a significant portion of NASA's planned space shuttle missions. The military projects are taking up the space shuttle missions, and that more than 100 of the first 560 space shuttle flights will carry military equipment and weaponry into space. Among the military items scheduled to be orbited are advanced laser weapons to counteract Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. NASA has commissioned a study last year of a huge array of mirrors in orbit that could be used to reflect the energy of ground-based lasers and shoot down enemy missiles. This was almost 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years in October. The infiltration of the peaceful exploration of space and space shuttle by the Pentagon with their military space projects. That article in the Washington Star said the Defense Department role as a major partner in space shuttle started in 1969, but the role of the CIA is even more hazy about what the CIA has been doing up there. By 1984, which is just 5 years away, 4 years and 6 months, NASA is going to have 4 orbiting space shuttles going. It will cost $16 billion. $4 billion is coming from the military, and the cost of this is $400 million higher than NASA forecast originally. They're asking for more and more money as time goes on, of course, and there's no accounting for that money, so we don't know what they're building. Gamby Publications, a small independent magazine, May 1979, has an article, Life on the High Frontier, Space Colonies of the 21st Century, and there's a review of Gerard O'Neill's book and drawings of these gorgeous little space colonies, that huge cornucopia, the one the government printing office uses. And again, a long article, the world is dying, the world population is increasing too fast, the pollution is too great, we're depleting the resources, There's hardly a stream left that isn't affected by pollution. There's factory smoke, automobile exhaust, and they mention the radioactive particles, and it goes into the building of the space colonies on why we have to have them and what they'll be like, and I'll give you the address if you want to order these. I can't discuss each article because that would take one whole tape, and for those of you who are interested, I'll give you the sources. I just want you to get the idea that this thing is taking place. In a UFO magazine, that I'll also give you the address of this magazine, on Park Avenue, there's an article on Alternative 3, a book review of it. It describes the book and the brain drain in England, how the scientists are trying to play God, and the use of mining operations on the moon for making these constructions. And it has some very important questions to ask about the seriousness and recommendations for what to do if this book is in fact true. Now, because there's a difference of opinion, say, between somebody like Charles and myself, who may not agree on the importance of it, doesn't mean that one of us is wrong or one of us is right. It means it needs a lot of hard thinking together to come to some conclusions that wishful thinking isn't going to wash away. In this book review of Alternative 3 in the UFO magazine, it recommends immediate corrective action. It said there should be immediate investigation with Congress and space ventures, including a study of what's going on, that we should round up the best minds that are available on planet Earth to evaluate their reports on whether this is necessary, that there should be immediate cessation of assassinations and mutilations and psychological abuse and interference with individual rights across the board. See, they understand the cessation of assassinations links to these phenomena, the mutilations linked to them, the psychological abuse, our mind control, the interference with our rights and choices aren't separate from the intent of these space colonies. It said they should open up all government files to public information that are gained with public funds, and that again goes back to the House Select Committee on Assassinations or the CIA and secrecy. And they should reiterate and reinstate military personnel and airline pilots and people who have seen these phenomena and are experiencing them and have been fired because they talked. They should be brought back. They shouldn't be punished. Just like that man was fired from the CIA for viewing sections of the John Kennedy assassination. He should be reinstated. He shouldn't be fired. It suggests that you have a rapid development of alternative sources of energy to replace fossil fuels and the pollutants. People continue to use the aerosol spray cans for insect bites and underarm deodorant and hairsprays and all kinds of things that are even worse, polluting the water, rivers, and everywhere. There are alternative ways to live. The Indians had them. Study primitive societies and go back to the primitive society. There is absolutely no reason to ruin this planet Earth with what we're doing. There's a suggestion that we ask for assistance for people to help us understand what they call extraterrestrial visitors, but we also need alternative psychiatrists to see people who say they've seen these people. Years ago, we used to lock them up. Now we parade them at UFO space conferences. We need other doctors in the room at the time who do not hypnotize them to say what they saw. Remember that Dr. Diamond hypnotized Sirhan and told him how he killed Robert Kennedy, how he shot Robert Kennedy. Dr. Edward Simpson Calas came along and said, no, he didn't shoot Robert Kennedy, and he was programmed to say he did, a hypnotist. Dr. Simpson Calas is a hypnotist, but he worked with Sirhan and got a different story, and he deprogrammed him. He got one story. When the hypnotist programmed him, he got another. These space people, these normal people, can be programmed to say who they were picked up by, who and when, by so-called experts in the space program, and be hypnotized. And it suggests that trained doctors and psychologists and coroners attend to the death, whether it's, these animal mutilations or people involved in this, and find out what chemicals, the ones that I talked about last week, they're involved in cattle mutilations, and eliminate, lastly, war on planets. We don't need these weapons. We don't need this radiation. Yes, it's gone too far, but it doesn't have to go further. And this review of Alternative 3 has suggestions which I don't think people like Charles would have trouble understanding. And this tape is like a dialogue between myself and him because I respect his work so much. I'm not trying to defend my position on anything I've written or said. I'm trying to explain it, to share the sources. I'm not saying it's happening and I said so, therefore you believe me. And I don't get pissed off with anybody. I just want them to read everything I've read and see it as I see it and correct me when I'm wrong. Don't correct me if you haven't read it. That's the only thing I don't like, is when people say, I disagree with your opinion on John Kennedy, and I say, well, have you even read Rush to Judgment? And they say no. When you've read what I've read, I'll have a dialogue with you. But until then, it's very difficult. And this review of what to do about Alternative 3 makes sense. These people understand the problem of the assassinations, the mutilations, the mind control, the interference with our rights, the secrecy of the government to lock up these reports, the firing of people who have seen what's going on, the psychological, medical manipulation of bodies, the coroners, the quick cremations. We've seen it all, and we have to get into it really fast. Penthouse, August 1976. See if you can get that article. If some of you can't get these articles, and if enough of you want them, I'll reproduce them at cost and get them to you. I'll figure out what it costs to copy these and get them to you, because some of these older articles are hard to get. This is Gerard O'Neill on pollution-free colonies. That was 1976. That was 3 years ago, where he was projecting that there would be the first 10,000 people there in the 1980s. This is 79. This research has gone on since 1969. The space colonies, he says, will hold from 10 to 20 million people. There will be agricultural and heavy industry carried on separately from the living areas. Does that remind you of Auschwitz and Peenemünde? In Alternative 3, the batch consignments will work and be separated, the slave labor that will feed the 20 million. O'Neill projected that it would cost $100 billion to begin the space colonies, but that is a fraction of the money if the federal government needs it. Even the money that they're saying they're putting into the missile program could be put to space colonies. We'd never see it and we'd never know it, and they're not going to use it for that kind of warfare. They could just transfer the funds and make it be a dummy front. Gerard O'Neill said as far back as 1976 that there would be some psychological readjustments, but with overpopulation and waning resources and pollution, it may provide, in quotes, the only way to give our tortured planet a time to heal its wounds. 90% of the Earth's population could be living in space within a short time span, and they asked Dr. Gerard O'Neill which 10% would live. 50 to 70 years from now, the Earth's pollution would be reduced by immigrating 90% of the population up to the Earth. This is what they're projecting, and he was saying several years ago it would be taking place in the 80s. He goes on to say in his Penthouse article, the first 10,000 would be carefully selected. Only 20 men were in the Apollo program. It would be technically possible to have 1 million people there within 24 years, and if 90% of the population migrated to the colonies, in quotes, Gerard O'Neill from Princeton, the Earth would probably be much more pleasant. Well, if 10% of the corporations and people control the resources of almost all of planet Earth, you can make sure that they're going to find planet Earth very pleasant if 90% of the people around them are removed and they don't have to look at them. He said most of the heavy manufacturing would be done in space. It's less expensive to manufacture, and he said, I envision a time when the Earth will have a stable population and will keep a continuous immigration up to the space colonies. This was written in Penthouse by the same Gerard O'Neill that had the conference in Princeton in May of 1979. And the picture that goes with Dr. Gerard O'Neill's article in the Penthouse is this very smiling, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant spaceman with a little space halo communication earphone over his ears, just beaming, and it says O'Neill on it, and he looks very happy about his whole project. Another article in the Minneapolis Star. Many of these articles came to me from Marge in Minneapolis, who's been collecting these for a long time. Scientists see space for people in space, and it talks from about Moscow, Associated Press article, Russians share interest in close encounters, UFO détente. That is the theme and the philosophy behind Alternative 3, that the Soviet Union is working closely with us, the coalition of aerospace companies, foundations, educational institutions because they realize the dangers that are taking place on planet Earth. New Solidarity, December 13th, 1977. U.S. Labor Party Space Program, International Project on the Exploration and Colonization of the Solar System, and they have a long article on the conjunction of the Soviet Union and the United States working, the Air Force and industries working together. It's a full page plus article on colonies and automation and manufacturing and exploration and building up the Mars fusion-based space colony in conjunction, as I say, with the Soviet Union. This is a lot of material. I have a lot of material. This isn't just one or two things from outer space, the beater variety, but this involves A, the intent, as I said, B, the capability, 3, the means, and that's all it takes is the intent, the means, and the capability. May 18th, 1979, New York Times, NASA awaits China's decision on spaceflight in 1982. They have to put a $1,000 deposit down for loading space on the space shuttle. Otherwise, they don't get a reservation. And right now, China has reserved flights number 24 and 32 scheduled for June 22nd and December the 2nd, 1982. But the other countries working with NASA are Canada, India, West Germany, Consortium of Arab countries, Western European countries, and NASA, which means NASA, Middle East, the Arab countries, Canada, India, and West Germany and Indonesia are making their reservations and working on these space colonies. China has to come up with $100,000 to keep the reservation for flights number 24 and 32, June 22nd, December 2nd, 1982. Did that tell you something, that something is going on up there? They're taking reservations for hardware to go up to space. I think it tells you a little bit. No more time on this tape. I could do 10 hours on Alternative 3, maybe next week a little bit more, but that's just a little bit of the material I have on the subject. You take care. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be with you next Friday. And save your space articles.